ABC Sports presents the season premiere of the United States Football League. Today, live from RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C., it's the Chicago Blitz versus the Washington Federals. This is the scene live in RFK Stadium. George Allen on the sidelines for the first time here since 1977. Across the way, Ray Yock, coaching here after 12 years in the Canadian Football League as head coach of the Washington Federals. A drizzly, cold day, not unlike the kind of weather you would expect here in RFK Stadium in late October or early November. It feels like football weather. Hello, I'm Jim Lampley, and I'll be honest with you. I will wait to see how many of you are that anxious to see football in spring, but everything I've seen and heard in the past 3 weeks leads me to believe that this experiment, the United States Football League, has a great chance of flying. Clearly, in my view, there are enough pro football players to go around for this league to field a credible product. And clearly, there are enough big-name football coaches, some of them with long-standing identities in American football, who are willing to commit themselves to this project. The rest is up to you. But if you're going to stick with us today, you're going to see a lot of new faces and a fascinating storyline. One of the new faces, Lee Corso, who is working here with us at ABC for the first time, formerly the head coach at the University of Indiana, and one of about 24 college football coaches whose contributions to American higher learning have been terminated in this past fall football season. Lee, very nice to have you with us. We're going to see in the personalities of George Allen and Ray Yock, two entirely different men, one of them well known to Americans, one of them not known at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody knows George Allen. They've heard about him. He's a fine football coach. But when you get down to it, I've known Ray Yock for about 10 years, and I'm very impressed with him. He's an intense individual. He looks a lot older than he is, but that's because he was a head coach a long time. He come out of the Canadian League with Edmonton and Winnipeg. He knows how to win.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get going, friends. How you doing? It's Tim Hanlon. Good Seats Still Available is the name of the podcast, and it's the curious little journey that we're on each and every week, despite all the odds against it, into what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for coming on by and saddle up because here we go. We're going to the old and original USFL, and it's a kind of an interesting time to go back to the original version of said league that is now fumpering along. Depending on your perspective, it's either off to a gigantically, blazingly interesting start, or it's kind of out of the gate, similar to other recent Challenger Football League exploits, such as the AAF and the second version of the XFL, obviously the third version coming next year. Interesting stuff, no doubt. Birmingham came out pretty nicely in terms of crowd size for the first ever game. It's obviously a little less so as the weeks progress, but we'll never forget the original USFL. We'll always look for reasons to get into that. And this week, an excuse has materialized, and we're happy for it. The writer that you need to know is Jake Russell. He's our guest this week. He, a longtime writer for the Washington Post, a lot of sports type stuff in particular. Great article about a week ago on April 15th that I highly commend for your viewing pleasure at WashingtonPost.com about the Washington Federals. Great news hook, of course, with the launching or relaunching of the league. And a perfect excuse, both for him in article form and us in podcast interview / conversation form. His article is called "As the USFL Restarts, a Look Back at the Washington Federals' Wild Ride." And we get into a conversation about not only the article, but the people that he talked to, Jake Russell did. People like the Pony. Craig James was part of that Washington Federals 2-year story. People like Ray Yock, people like Kim McQuilkin, quarterback for at least that first year of the Washington Federals, and a bunch of others. And fun stuff. And it's a great story. The Washington Federals, in your humble host's opinion, I think had the best logo scheme of any of the original USFL teams. I'll fight you on that. But, we can agree to disagree on that. But pretty darn good stuff. And it's pretty interesting, too, of course, that the Washington Federals was not one of the teams that was decided to be reincarnated or brought back to life in version 2.0 going on down there in Birmingham now. Perhaps for good reason, as we'll get into our conversation with Jake in a few minutes. I think depending on your perspective, the Federals are probably the most woeful of the teams from the original league. They posted nary, I think it was 7 wins altogether across 2 seasons, something along those lines. They were, not necessarily the greatest thing on the field, but then again, neither were the Pittsburgh Maulers, who we talked about a couple of weeks back with our pal Tom Rooney. They only lasted 1 season and were quite terrible on the field as well. But, regardless of which ones are coming back and which ones we remember and stuff, and the Washington Federals were unique, like many of the teams were in the USFL for their own various reasons. We talk about sort of the things that beset the team, obviously only winning 4 games in their first season and winning only, 3 games in their second season. They came literally kind of at the last minute as a USFL franchise. I think the original intent of the ownership group was to have a team actually in Birmingham. And when the Stallions were announced, and Don Dixon being sort of part of that mixture, the ownership of Burl Bernhardt was taken away, I guess, if you will, to Birmingham instead, and instead created a sort of a somewhat slapdash and almost last minute kind of minority ownership structure, which immediately doomed the franchise to I wouldn't call it analysis paralysis, but decision making became very difficult. Right, you had many chiefs in the house, all of them with ownership stakes, and making decisions both on and off the field were automatically going to be difficult because of such. You have to also remember, too, that the Washington Federals took the field only, 5, maybe 6 weeks after the Washington, then known as Redskins, won their first Super Bowl championship in, it must have been at least 2 or 3 decades since. So there was a halo effect going on, at least assumed that the Federals would inherit playing at the same RFK Stadium. But the reality is quite different. The NFL franchise had been a long-suffering endeavor in DC and had finally cracked the code on winning the Super Bowl. So they were pretty much the thing, and launching a brand new franchise in the wake of that. You could make the argument that no worse time to launch a new football franchise after the Redskins then had conquered the nation's capital. But it's all part of the interesting and often dysfunctional story of the Washington Federals. And you heard Jim Lampley and his then new booth pal, the great Lee Corso, kind of opining on perhaps even some skepticism in the booth about what was going to happen. And that, by the way, was the first ever game and broadcast of the USFL on ABC. In 1983. Let's see, that was April. Oh, my goodness. No, sorry, March 6th against the Chicago Blitz. And another key, interesting, fun fact story about this franchise. Who was the first coach to invade RFK Stadium to play against said Washington Federals? Yeah, it was the old coach, George Allen. I mean, this is a guy who essentially was, Mr. Redskins for so many years as coach and stuff, and his wily ways of gathering intelligence and all that kind of stuff. So a harbinger of not great things already underway. It was a doomy, gloomy, rainy day at RFK Stadium that day, and it didn't really get a whole much better than that. But fun and interesting conversation, though, as we remember what perhaps should be unmemorable, the Washington Federals of the original USFL, with our guest this week, Washington Post sports writer Jake Russell, coming up in a few moments' time. Fun conversation, and stick around. You will enjoy it. How about a promotional shout out this week, of course, to our pal Judd Lasher, and it's 417helmets.com. 417helmets.com. It's collectible helmets and more. And a promo code for you there for 10% off all of your purchases is Good Seats. Use that early and often. Good Seats, the promo code at 417helmets.com. And of course, the original USFL is celebrated in all its glory with every franchise's mini helmet. What are mini helmets? Well, like the name implies, they're smaller versions of handcrafted, quality grade miniature helmets. They're basically made of the same materials from the same places as the big boys, and they're big helmets, and they're lovingly crafted. They've got all the original artwork and color schema, and of course, there's a gorgeous looking Washington Federals 1983 Riddell Speed Mini Football helmet for you to purchase among all the other USL franchises at 417helmets.com. Mini helmets from not only the old USFL, but the CFL and the World League of American Football, the World Football League, the XFL, the original version thereof, even collegiate helmets from the NCAA, the NAIA for you small college fans out there, and even some mini baseball helmets, a relatively new offering at 417helmets.com from Major League Baseball and the Negro Leagues. And there's other great stuff there too, all around. Hey, and you want to make a custom helmet, mini helmet for your friends, perhaps as a giveaway for your company, all that kind of stuff. Well, Judd can hook you up and spec out the best of what you're imagining in his creative team there. All of that and more can be found again at 417helmets.com. And again, the promo code for all of your purchases and 10% off all of them is Good Seats. Please use that early and often, and give Judd a look, and you're going to find a few things for sure that you're going to enjoy. And why not a Washington Federals mini helmet? Why not celebrate the episode that we're going to get into right now? Here's our conversation that we had just last week as we tinker with the current version of the USFL by way of our memories and lamentations, if you will, of the old Washington Federals. Here's our conversation with Jake Russell that we had just a few days ago. Please, as always, enjoy. Why don't you give our audience a little bit of a sense of your background? You're a journalist by trade, and maybe sort of how the idea to kind of news peg a long forgotten team and frankly, one that's not sort of easily or happily remembered in Washington, D.C. To your editors as a story to pursue.
Yeah, so I guess you can consider me part of that niche audience who actually enjoys spring football. Like, I watched the Washington Valor when they were in the Arena Football League in D.C. I covered the D.C. Defenders for the Post when they were with the XFL for those 5 games they were there.
Yeah, and those monster beer cups, right? The snake,
the beer snake, yeah.
Yeah, legendary.
That helped put Audi Field on the map. Yeah, so I'm very interested in spring football. I grew up a massive football fan, so I mean, I'm not the type who gets tired of it and wants it to stop necessarily. Like, I even watched the AAF when it was around, not really as strongly as I'd watch the XFL, but I still watched it nonetheless. For me, more is better when it comes to football. Even if the play on the field's not, if it's bad, I'll just turn it off. So there's like no harm in having an extra league. So I thought a couple months ago, I said, you know what, with the USFL coming back, I figured it would be nice to take a fun trip down in memory lane and cover the old Washington Defenders who, you know, growing up, I was well aware of, but obviously I never got to see. They predated my existence. So they'd always been a little bit of a curiosity with me and a fascination. So for me, I pitched it to my editors, and they said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So whenever they tell me that, I'm going to take the ball and run with it. No football pun intended. So I went and I reached out to 4 former Washington Federals, Craig James, Mike Hohensee, Kim McQuilkin, and Joey Walters, and got their experience on the team and their experience with being in DC, being with the Federals, and kind of how it compared to the rest of their careers. And it was just fun getting the chance to chat with them. And whenever they told me a story, it was almost like I was back there living that with them back in the early to mid 80s before I was even born. So it was just a fun little trip down, I guess, memory lane for everybody else but me. But
so
yeah, it was a fun project to work on.
Yeah. So what did you think? What did you think about this team going into it? Obviously based on research and maybe a little bit of Jeff Perlman's book, our former guest. And so what did you think you knew about this team kind of going in? Like, what was your perception before you even reached out to these guys?
Well, I knew they were terrible. And part of the problem, or part of the challenge, not the problem, but the challenge with this was coming up with a story to write about a terrible football team in DC without, beating the readers over the head with the idea that it was a bad football team, because they get enough of those stories year in and year out with the NFL team in town. So I was trying to think of fun, interesting, quirky, different things to write about with this team. And for me, growing up as a kid, I don't know if you looked in the story or not and saw the YouTube video that's on there, but there's a YouTube video embedded in my story about the Federals, and it's a USFL Football Follies blooper video, which I'm 34, but I'm kind of an old 34. I grew up with VHS tapes. So I had that VHS tape as a kid. And as a kid, I'd seen the Federals portion of it. I was like, man, it didn't really like click as like a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old watching that, like how bad they were and how weird some of those situations were. Like when Ray Yawk pulled the gun on his players and then the team actually broke out in laughter when he pretended to shoot 2 of his players. Like something like that would never fly now. So as a kid, and I saw that, like, oh, haha, that's a funny, interesting anecdote. But as an adult now in 2022, I'm like, oh my God, that would never work. No coach would try to pull that. And if they did, they'd be fired and banned from sports immediately. So it's also a kind of like a look back on the era of the time that they were living in too, not just, the team itself. So it was really fun going back and learning about the history of the team and kind of adding some more information and learning more about the team that I already knew. And it was just fun going back and listening to the stories the players had to tell.
Why don't we dig into that story among many, right? So why don't you, a little bit of background on the coach. He was obviously a winning, he was a proven winner in the CFL. And I got to think that the CFL was an immediate place to find some of the initial players and all that kind of stuff, not just for the Federals, but the league in general. But maybe a little bit about sort of what led up to this story, because this was actually in the second year or the beginning of the second year of what was already a very woeful situation, at least on the field.
You talk about the gun incident?
Yeah. So yeah, a little bit of Ray. I don't even know how you pronounce his last name.
Yawk. Ray Yawk. Yeah.
Yawk. There you go.
Almost kind of like how the team played on the field. Yuck. So for them, he was, I believe, the 4th winningest coach in CFL history at the time when he moved on to the Federals. For him, from what I understand from at least Kim McQuilkin, he was admittedly not a member of the Ray Yawk fan club. So from what I understand from him, that Ray didn't necessarily adjust to the American game, I guess, as well as he should have. Kim told me a story about how, and I believe that's in the story as well, about how Ray would have golf clubs in his car and they would bring them out during practice and practice his golf swing. And then he would also leave. They were supposed to have a film session and go over plays and stuff like that in the playbook. And Ray would leave early to go play golf, and he would leave the meetings to Dick Bielski, the offensive coordinator. So for them, it was kind of a lot of blending of different experiences with the players and the coaches. And leading up to the incident, I believe it was in the first year, because they were wearing white helmets in that video. So they wore white helmets for the first year and then gray or silver helmets for the next season.
You are correct, sir. My mistake.
Yeah. So offensive lineman Mike Horton, who went on to become Gemini in American Gladiators, and defensive back Don Burrell had been going at it in practice several times during that season, and they had done it yet again. So it was one of those things where, players were used to it. They're like, oh God, here we go again. And then Ray Yawk walks in and splits them up and goes in between them, has his hand in his right pocket of his green jacket. He goes, hey, I've had enough of this. And he pulls out his gun and he pretends to shoot both of them. So you hear these blanks, these pops going off, boom, boom. And then both players fall on the ground pretending to be shot. And then after a few seconds, they get up and the whole team bursts out in laughter. Like it's just thinking about that is insane. Like you would never think that would ever happen, especially nowadays. That would never happen now. So thinking back on that story, it's just like as a kid, you know, when you're a kid, you see things, you don't necessarily process it fully and completely the way you would as an adult. I'm like, oh, that's quite an interesting little anecdote about the Federals, because that video had about a 5-minute segment on the Federals and how they had a bunch of close losses and they just found new ways to lose and heartbreaking ways to lose. And then obviously it led up to that shooting incident. But thinking back now, it's insane that a coach would even try that, but it worked. The players laughed, and it didn't necessarily help on the field because they were still bad, but it helped at least break up the monotony of a difficult season and the tensions that were building up from the players. So clearly him and Horton and Burrell were in cahoots beforehand. So they had planned that in advance, clearly, because then after that, the two players went and high-fived each other and then went to their respective huddles. It's just one of the more interesting things I've ever seen when it comes to sports.
Yeah, I mean, wow. I mean, just the idea of how to break up tension. I mean, that's sort of a new level. But yeah, of course, that could that ever? Well, let's also put this in context, right? So the debut of the USFL and the Federals as one of the first year teams, they lasted 2 seasons, literally came, 4 or 5 months after the Washington Redskins, formerly known as, won the World Championship and the Super Bowl, right? Which had been, 40 years of a drought in Washington sports history. So the best of times, the worst of times, right? To create a franchise in the same stadium just after the NFL championship season of the Skins. I guess in hindsight, that seems like a bad idea, but.
Yeah, so the first game was actually 5 weeks after the first Super Bowl. The Redskins won the Super Bowl. So that's one of those things, because I asked the players that I talked to, I said, do you think, following up on the beginning of the Redskins dynasty hurt or helped the Federals? And the reactions are kind of mixed, but ultimately, if the Federals had won, that would have kept the fans engaged. But it rained almost every home game at RFK the first year, and the team was playing bad and finding new ways to lose. Maybe if they had won, the fans would keep coming back despite the rain. But following up on a dynasty like that, that's one of those things, in my opinion, that could have just as easily 50-50 worked for or against the Federals, because if the Federals had just won, that would just satiate the appetite of football fans in D.C. They would keep going. They're saying, all right, this is a nice extension of the Redskins dynasty we're witnessing here, or a talented Redskins team. Obviously, they lost. So clearly that drove fans away, and then the rain was not any help. And then the heat that came on later in the summer, or later in the spring and summer. So it was one of those things where it could have worked easily for or against them. But it was just kind of, if they had won, it would have been great timing for them. But since they lost, clearly bad timing to follow up on that team.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the weather, because I remember some of those early games and the Federals games, usually highlights, because I was living in the New York metropolitan area at that time. So as people may not remember, I mean, at least on Sundays, they were regionally divided, not unlike the NFL. So we didn't get many Federals games, maybe by luck or by happenstance. But yeah, I always remembered it seemed like it was raining or cold or whatever. And I think that's lost on a lot of sort of USFL 1.0 historians, right? And spring football enthusiasts, for that matter, right? I mean, a reminder, hello, it's pretty damn cold and depending on where you are, lingering in places like Chicago and in Boston and New York and DC. And those first few weeks can be very dicey, very questionable, and often very disappointing, especially when you're starting something from scratch, brand new, trying to get people to come. Although that didn't stop people, the curiosity seekers, from that very first game, right? That was probably the largest crowd they ever had.
Yeah, they had more than 38,000 at that first game, which is an incredible number if you think about it for a spring league. And it just goes to show, even for like the worst team in the league, that you can have even that kind of attendance. Obviously, they weren't the worst team in the league yet. That was about to come. But to have those kind of numbers is just an incredible thing to think about, especially when you compare it to now. The NFL has just a complete stranglehold on just they basically have a monopoly on the world of football, especially in the fall. And sports in general, they are the king of sports in the entire world. It's just a huge superpower when it comes to sports. So when you compare the Federals having 38,000 for the first game compared to the DC Defenders, who averaged about 15,000 in the 3 home games they had at Audi Field in DC in 2020, and thinking about that, that's a really good number that people have, because Audi Field holds 20,000. If you get 75% capacity for an unknown venture like the XFL in DC, because they never had it there before. In 2001, they didn't have it in DC. And thinking back about how good of a number averaging 15,000 is, thinking back at 38,000, that's almost hard to imagine. But also, yeah, it just goes to show how much the NFL has grown to where you can have 15,000 people, and that's a good number for an alternative football league.
Yeah, and clearly it's also a different media world, and the reliance on tickets is a little different, especially when television seems to be the front and foremost of the product and stuff. Well, I'm going to get your thoughts on spring football generally near the end of this conversation, so don't lose that enthusiasm. But let me go back to a few of the names that you reached out to for this piece. You mentioned one of them, actually somebody that I knew from my days is in the media agency space, Kim McQuilkin, who was I knew as a veteran of the television Cartoon Network days of the old Turner Broadcasting part of Time Warner. But he was also the quarterback, or basically the lead quarterback for this team. But if you look at some of the info on Kim's career. So first of all, interesting, right? Because he played for the Skins for, I guess, 78 through 1980. So he at least was a known commodity, possibly to Federals fans, although the Federals didn't start until 83. But he was also, I guess, depending on your statistics, rated as one of the worst performing professional passers in the NFL's history, which is, I don't know, maybe a badge of honor or I don't know, but what did you expect when you reached out to him, and what did he sort of tell you? Obviously, a bunch of memories there.
Yeah, I didn't know what to expect because I didn't necessarily know that much about the roster beyond, Craig James and Coy Bacon. I didn't know that much beyond those two guys. So I quickly learned what kind of personality Kim McQuilkin has. He reminded me a little bit of Joe Theismann in terms of how he told stories. He had a lot of energy looking back on his experience with the Federals, and he was kind of a reporter's dream. Like, he would give you stories and he would hit on all your interview notes before you even asked the question. You wouldn't even have to ask anything. He would already hit on one story to another, and it was just really fun listening to his enthusiasm. And he had just such a quick, snappy recollection of back then from 39 years ago. It was just really fun just to sit back and let him do my work for me and tell me all these stories about his experience with the Federals, with his teammates, with the USFL, and obviously his time before that with the Redskins. That guy has a big personality, and he was telling me stories about how he was a roommate with Craig James, and Craig James, I talked to him, and I told Craig that I had interviewed Kim, and Kim recommended me reach out to him, and Craig said, "Oh boy, I have to respond now. I can only imagine what Kim said about me." So those two guys are still friends to this day. So it was really fun just sitting back and listening to him tell all these stories about his time with the Federals.
Craig James, probably the most known and I guess even revered in terms of his skill, a player on that Federals team. What was his recollections? Because this is a guy who, was an absolute standout with the old Pony Express with SMU, and probably the marquee player for this franchise, but very little else, I think, if you look back at that roster in terms of, high caliber and, all pro type players for sure.
Yeah. I asked all the players kind of like to summarize their experience, and I think they all enjoyed the teammates they had on their team, I think they all got along. There was I don't think there was much friction necessarily between the players aside from, a couple fights here and there in practices. But I think as a team, they all got along. They just didn't have the talent on that roster. And, every team essentially had their own superstar to market around. The Generals had the New Jersey Generals had Herschel Walker, and he was essentially the face of the league to start. And Craig James was the Federals' answer to Herschel Walker, and to get him to join the USFL as opposed to the NFL was a big boost for the Federals and their big marketing ploy to kind of like, hey, you guys know this guy. He played with the SMU, with the Pony Express, him and Eric Dickerson. See one half of the famed Pony Express with the Federals. Come on down to RFK. With James, his production didn't match the talent that he had, partly because the offensive line that he had in front of him was subpar, and the talent just in general was subpar. And eventually injuries took over, and he told me, he never really dealt with injuries much before. He had a pretty healthy track record before going to USFL, and that took a toll on him. And he eventually kind of lost, I guess, just the passion, the fun kind of wore off for him being in the USFL. And eventually he worked out a deal to get released by the Federals and then join his old coach at SMU, Ron Meyer, up in New England with the Patriots. And that's when he joined the NFL, was in the middle of the 1984 season. So his reign in D.C. did not last very long. I believe, I forget the number. I think he played only 10 or 16 of the 26 games. So he missed quite a bit of time and didn't get the chance to fully show the talent that he had.
Why do you think, in reaching out to these players and some of your research and stuff, why do you think the team was so poor? It seems like there are a handful of reasons, perhaps the ownership being maybe prime among them. It seems Byzantine, this ownership structure. And it led to, I think, a lot of different sort of situations, including, I think, not even having sort of full access to RFK Stadium for practices and play.
Yeah, from what I understand, I believe I saw a quote from the primary team owner, Burl Bernard, saying something along the lines of how their team was set up and established after a bunch of other teams had been set up, and they believe they could compete with the finances that they had on deck, when yet other teams were spending much more than them. I think if they had a much more, financially stable ownership group, they could have established a better roster and brought on better players. A lot of their money was also tied up in Craig James. I'm not sure how much of the Jeff Pearlman book you remember, but there was a nugget in there about how Craig James had held the Federals hostage for about 45 minutes. He delayed his introductory press conference by about 45 minutes when his agent / SMU booster held the Federals hostage for $500,000 for an extra $500,000 raise. And I asked James about that, and he said he didn't really remember the particulars, but he didn't regret, doing that. And then, if the Bernard and the ownership group didn't have that kind of money to put towards other players to build a better roster around him, that's on them and not him. So I guess that's kind of a forward-thinking mentality for players, because now players are thinking about themselves more often than they used to, because they obviously understand how short an NFL or football career can be and how tough these injuries are on players' bodies and over time. So, I think if the Federals had a more financially stable ownership group, they could have fielded a better roster despite, kind of having a little bit of a slow start after a bunch of other USFL teams began.
Yeah, I get the sense that the Federals were one of the last teams to get sort of solidified. My understanding is that Marvin Warner, who wound up becoming the owner of the Birmingham Stallions, because he was, I think, originally from, or his hometown was Birmingham, and he was originally slated to be the owner of the Federals, but when the league, I guess, announced that they were going to go to Birmingham as a franchise, he went there instead. And I think that also maybe set up maybe the scramble to kind of get some kind of ownership sort of structure in place, which seemed like it was like a limited partnership that had a general partnership element to it wrapped around some other ownership thing. It seemed like, I'm guessing, that some of the decision-making, perhaps maybe around personnel or budgeting and all that kind of stuff was probably a little bit more complicated and worse relatively quick, given I guess the relatively last stages of getting this franchise off the ground. But, when you're setting up a league, right, as we've talked to with the late Dennis Murphy, hallowed founder of many challenger leagues over the years, it's really about getting that footprint established and, by whatever means necessary. And, you kind of maybe keep your fingers crossed and say a couple of prayers before the first game to hope that it all comes together. But it ordinarily doesn't always happen that way.
No, it doesn't. And, you brought up the whole personnel angle. The general manager that the Federals brought on, Dick Myers, was the assistant general manager with the Redskins before that. But his specialty, from what I understand, was, in finances, not necessarily football personnel and building, a top roster. So that I don't think that helped them in that department of building a team either. It was kind of like they were, in a way, cursed is probably a strong word, but they were kind of set up to not do well. And that's what Craig James said. He said, you probably could have brought Joe Gibbs and the Washington Redskins, a whole coaching staff, and we still wouldn't have won. We just weren't set up to win. And that's kind of a common theme. The players kind of all agreed. We had some talented players, but we didn't have enough of them, and the results the results showed it.
Yeah, you mentioned the pairing of McQuilkin, I can't even say his name today. My goodness, McQuilkin and James as I guess as roommates in training camp and whatnot. And back to McQuilkin for a second. I guess, well, first of all, James is just coming out of college, and McQuilkin's been around, if you will, in the league with the Falcons, and then for a couple of years with the Redskins as Theismann's largely as his backup, right? But it had been a couple of years since McQuilkin had actually played pro ball before he came back to the Federal. So this wasn't necessarily like an immediate halo of the Redskins for him. I mean, interesting. If this is going to be your lead quarterback, he hasn't played in a couple of years. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, and Kim told me that he was actually originally on the Philadelphia Stars minicamp roster, but Myers remembered him from their time with the Redskins, so they worked out a deal for him to come to the Federals. And I guess he was their established veteran. I guess they wanted to have a veteran presence somewhat with Mike Hohensee coming fresh out of the University of Minnesota. I guess they wanted to have a veteran presence to go along with the young rookie with the big arm. So, yeah, that whole pairing him with Craig James was quite the interesting dynamic, because they both kind of established when they talked to me, Craig was more focused on football, and Kim was at that point in his career and his life where he was just more interested in, going out and having fun with his teammates as opposed to, establishing a dominant USFL career. I mean, obviously he enjoyed the game and enjoyed his teammates and enjoyed playing and tried to put some effort out there, but he wasn't as interested in establishing his name as Craig James was, because James knew what was ahead of him. He knew that he could have been an NFL first round pick, and he knew that he has, I don't know how much they talked about it in the early 80s, but how much of a brand he had at the time and how he kind of had to establish that and make a name for himself. So it was kind of interesting having these two, these two guys with these two different points of their careers. One was not necessarily as focused on his career as the other. And, obviously it worked out personality wise because they became good friends, and they're still friends almost 40 years later. It was just interesting to think, what led Ray Yawk to pair these two together in training camp. I mean, I guess it makes sense. You have your starting quarterback going into the season and then your star running back. But obviously, I guess in football years, a 10-year difference is, a big gap in terms of, establishing a roommate and establishing a rapport with, someone on and off the field. But it turned out on the field, it didn't turn out too great, but off the field, they've turned out to be lifelong friends since.
All right, what's this? How about sportshistorycollectibles.com? Oh, boy. We love sportshistorycollectibles.com. You've heard us talk about it forever since we began this show. One of our earliest sponsors, our pal Dean Mitchell, out in San Diego. And as the name implies, it's memorabilia from all those leagues and teams that came and went and thrived and failed, but nevertheless shaped the North American sports landscape of today. And if you're looking for ticket stubs or mini helmets, DVDs, pennants, jackets, even newspapers or stadium replicas, magnets, schedules, media guide, you name it. It's all there for you at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And we're talking about the best in forgotten sports history, in basketball and soccer and football and baseball and hockey and all kinds of miscellaneous sports like tennis and racing, the stadiums, the Olympics even. Just amazing stuff. And, you probably have eBay on your brain when you're thinking about looking for some of those items out there. And sure, eBay's pretty darn good, I guess. And there's, of course, some high-end auction sites out there, too, for sure. But sportshistorycollectibles.com is unique in that it focuses on those things that this here podcast is obsessed about, which are things that aren't around anymore, in particular teams and leagues and various related ephemera. And the good stuff is also highly photographed and well described, so you know what you're getting, and the prices really can't be beat. You don't have to worry about losing out on bids at the last minute and all that kind of stuff. And trust me, Dean's got stuff that you're looking for, and is getting new stuff, not new stuff, but new old stuff, like inventory. That's it. That's what I'm looking for. All kinds of refreshed inventory all the time. So it's just a sight to behold. So you'll lose hours of time just looking and ogling, if you will, digitally, the items from your childhood or from various followings of teams that you might have just plain old forgotten. And to see those items there for you and well photographed, you're gonna be amazed. Then, after looking at more than a few of them, you're gonna say, "Gosh, I gotta have me one or a bunch of them." And that's where our promo code comes in handy, and that's Good Seats. A promo code Good Seats for you at sportshistorycollectibles.com for 15% off all of your purchases. Again, our thanks to Dean Mitchell and his pals at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Promo code Good Seats for 15% off all of your purchases. As they say, you'll be glad you did. Thanks, Dean, for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. In your Federals piece for the Post, you had a nice anecdote around that first game and the setup of that, and the irony of it. Chicago Blitz and a guy by the name of George Allen being the first game. So in addition to being mere weeks after his former franchise in the NFL winning the Super Bowl, and he being the coach of the opposing Chicago Blitz in that very first game, maybe you can sort of give a little bit of detail about sort of that story, because not only did they literally and figuratively get blitzed, the Federals did that first game, but I think that conspiracy theorists out there would say that George Allen kind of was already on the case even before that game was even announced.
Yeah, so DC football fans, anyone attending the game at RFK were well aware of Allen's penchant for paranoia and his idiosyncrasies and his willingness to win at whatever cost. Like, he's the same guy who traded the same draft pick twice. He would turn off the opposing team showers at RFK. So he had very interesting ways about him. He would have when he was the Redskins head coach, he would have a retired police officer patrol around the fields in the woods looking for spies. Ironically enough, it's almost like he was projecting several years forward. So as the coach of the Blitz, so the lead up of our March 1st, 1983 story, it was about Ray Yawk and the team and how they had their first practice outside of RFK leading up to the game. And the lead of the story was, quote, Ray Yawk was looking for spies in search of George Allen's agents of terror and espionage at the Federals' first workout here yesterday. He pointed to a dark tower looming above the RFK Stadium practice field. Quote, I thought I saw someone climb up there, the Washington coach said. The tower, though, was free of human presence. Little did he know his instincts were pretty good. He should have trusted himself and not joked about it.
He was really worried,
Jeff Perlman,
He was really worried, wasn't he?
So I can't tell that, because I don't know whether he was, being funny or he was actually paranoid about, George Allen's reputation and all that stuff. But according to Jeff Perlman's book, Football for a Buck, about the USFL, he had a note in there about how Allen sent a couple of low-level Chicago Blitz employees to Washington to film Federals practices. And what they had done was they had worn yellow USFL staff windbreakers, and they told Ray Yawk and GM Dick Myers that they were USFL film crew personnel. And so the Yawk and Myers clearly did not do background checks. I guess that wasn't much of a thing with the USFL in the in the 80s. So those two employees had free reign to film Federals practice, and a blitz assistant coach told Perlman that we knew every play they were running. There were no surprises. And shocker, the Federals lost 28-7. And that was when fan interest for the Federals peaked. That was when they had 38,000 fans in the stands at RFK to see a beloved coach on the opposing sideline that they loved. Little did they know that they were going to be, them and their new team were going to fall victim to his antics. That's just one of those little, I love little things like that, where there's so many historical tie-ins. Like, it's almost like turns into a rope. There's so many tie-ins. Like, with George Allen returning to RFK for the first time since coaching the Redskins, and then with him pulling off all this espionage on the team. I don't know. I just love those kind of interesting nuggets, and that I had to include that in the story. Like, there was no way I was going to not have that in the story.
So when you were talking to these guys, I mean, there's some hagiography and some sort of like funny and anecdotal kind of, memories and stuff, and a bit of fondness, I'm sure. But I'm sure there's also a bit of wistfulness in that, and even into 1984. I mean, you had some other players come in, like a Reggie Collier, to kind of quarterback the team, and he was certainly a name at the time and had done fairly well in the first season with the Stallions in '83 and that kind of stuff. But I mean, you mentioned it before. They were woeful in the first year, and they were probably even a little bit more woeful the second year. It had to have at the time kind of gotten to these guys because a bunch of these players used to playing decent football and in winning ways in their pasts, and they're kind of just got this big gigantic anchor around their necks because they just weren't winning. That had to grate on them.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was thinking about, during the process of doing this story. Just, I peaked athletically, I guess, at 10. Even then, I was mediocre at best. And to think, as someone who becomes like a professional, and gets paid for it, and they're a grown adult, they're trying to provide for themselves, trying to provide for their family, they're trying to establish a future for themselves professionally and personally, all these little factors that play in, and to not just lose, but to lose as much as they did, and in the manner in which they did it, it just had to take a, psychological toll, unless they're really good at compartmentalizing this kind of stuff and saying, you know what, I'm a football player, but it does not define me as a person. I don't know I guess every person is different. You have, I think they had 40-some players on a roster back then, so you have 40-some different personalities, different ways of viewing life, different ways of viewing the game that they play, and who knows how many of them actually play it because they're talented. Who knows how many of them play it because they actually love the game. But I just had to imagine, as a competitor, that just took a really big toll on them. And, when I asked all the players, they said they enjoyed playing with each other. They enjoyed their experience with the team. That the losing was just what sucked the most, and for lack of a better word. It was just the grind of not really knowing, when your next win's going to be, when you're actually going to have a winning streak, or, what the results are going to be, if you're actually going to have good results coming up. I think they won, I believe they won 3 of their last 4 in their first year. So I guess they had some sort of hope going into the second season, but, those hopes were quickly dashed. And I have to imagine, as a competitor, it probably took a toll on them at the time, and hopefully they got over it pretty quick. Hopefully they're not still harboring, any resentment or stress from it, because, at the end of the day, it's just sports. And that's coming from somebody who loves sports. I've always loved sports, but it shouldn't let it, necessarily dictate your life, dictate your personality, dictate your moods and emotions, once you step off the field, at least to it. Obviously, it's understandable to let it affect you a little bit, because as a competitor, you want to win every single time you step on the field, but it shouldn't necessarily affect you beyond, once you get home. It shouldn't affect your daily life in a negative manner, at least.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess you have to sort of frame this all in the time period, right? This was a league that arguably was by many accounts perhaps an absolute strong and potentially viable challenger to the NFL, at least in a spring sort of echo, I guess, of a fall season. And Lord knows we know the whole story of sort of what ultimately happened. But, again, you look back and I, in my social feeds and stuff, when the second version of the USFL was announced, right, noticing that the Washington Federals were not brought back, and there's obvious reasons, right? They only won, 7 games of 2 seasons.
7-29, not great, right. Bob.
So, but actually, I think it's interesting though that the Pittsburgh Maulers, probably an equally bad team, and they only lasted 1 season in Pittsburgh. So you could make an argument that maybe Pittsburgh was arguably the worst of the two. But they're back, right? And so it's very interesting because I as we talked with our pal Tom Rooney, he a descendant of the Pittsburgh Steelers Rooney family and active in getting that franchise up and running and going back then in Pittsburgh. It's just interesting. I one of the first questions I asked him was, where's the nostalgia for the Maulers and why are they back? I mean, at least I think the Federals had probably one of the coolest looking logos and color schemes of all those teams. And I guess the question in there is, why not Washington? They've got a stadium for it and stuff. If you're going to bring it all back, why not the Federals? Because, at least the logos will probably sell a little bit better than some of the other ones.
Yeah, I think this is just a theory on my part. No one from either league has said anything publicly, and I'm just guessing this is the case, and it's probably an educated guess on my part. I think they just don't want to have teams in the same cities that would possibly be in the XFL. So I don't think, if the Defenders are coming back, I don't think they would want the Federals to be back and having to fight for a space to play football, because Audi Field is obviously the best space for a spring professional football team. So I don't think they want to have any, cross-pollination with, cities, having multiple spring football teams and then having to split up the revenue between those two teams and possibly having one or both of those teams fail because they have no revenue coming in because there's a competitor in their own town. So that's just my theory as to why the Federals aren't back. I don't know if the Defenders are actually coming back or not. I think it would be good for the town. It would be nice to give them an alternative to the Commanders, who, the former Redskins, now current Washington Commanders. They'll give them a nice alternative in the spring of 2023. And I think based on the attendance in 2020, there's a lot of reason to bring them back. You brought up the beer snake. You can see the enthusiasm that the fans had. And at those games, fans were wearing like jerseys of like almost every team from every sport. It was just like a conglomeration of people uniting to watch this one team. It wasn't just unhappy Redskins fans going to Audi Field to watch an alternative. There was a bunch of that, of course, because they wanted to see something different and something more fun and fresh and provide them with a better game day experience than they get at FedEx Field. But I think I think it would be smart of the XFL to bring the Defenders back. And if they do, that was potentially why the Federals weren't chosen as a USFL 2.0 team this time around.
Yeah, that's a good thought. And this sort of leads me into sort of a broader question. Being a spring, if you will, football enthusiast, as we stated in the beginning, and whatever becomes of this new USFL, obviously it's going to be domiciled in Birmingham and not actually be in any of these cities. And I think even in year 2, it's not even envisioned that they would be in these cities, but who knows? And that's if they survive the legal challenges, I think, around the copyrights and the trademarks and stuff, which I think is the part of the suit that the judge literally just yesterday or the day before kind of said there's viability in that claim. But I guess the question I would sort of have is, with television being different the way it is and streaming being a viable component of that, and these unwittingly soccer-specific stadiums, like in the case of DC United and Audi Field, you've got now 20, 25,000 seaters that arguably are more conducive to something more fledgling in football versus having to fill cavernous stadia like FedEx Field or, Met Stadium per se in East Rutherford or whatever, right? I mean, you can have 15,000 people and it feels full-ish without having to worry about sort of the fan experience, and let alone television, which is kind of really the beast that needs to be fed.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm still not sure. I don't know if it's, been explained or not. If it has, I completely missed it. I'm not sure exactly why they chose the one city model for the regular season. I don't know if it was because of, the pandemic or because it was financially better for the league to start off that way.
I think it's because the spring league that Brian Woods had set up, which is the shell of what this is sort of evolving from, was a kind of a one city kind of thing, although it's a whole different matter. And then Fox just said, let's just make it, but yeah, I mean, I as a starter, it makes a lot of sense. You cost contain, but if you're going to have actual cities in the mix, that's a tough transition if you're going to do that.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense to me. Like, why would you have location names in front of the team nicknames if you're not going to actually play in those locations and establish a foothold in those markets and try to build your own fan base? I don't know. I don't know if the playing in Birmingham all regular season and Canton, Ohio for the postseason will work. I'm going to watch. I don't know how much I'm going to watch, but I'm going to try to watch as much as possible.
We all do, don't we? We all get sucked in the beginning, don't we?
Exactly, and it's just a matter of time as to when the numbers drop off. But for me, I don't know. I don't know if this makes me a traditionalist or get off my lawn, an old fuddy-duddy. It doesn't make that much sense to me to play in just one city, especially if you have locations in front of the nicknames and you're trying to market to those groups of fans. Why would you not play in front of said fans that you're trying to market those teams to? It's kind of like with the PLL Premier Lacrosse League. They don't have any location names in front of the team nicknames, and it's just a touring league. It just goes around from city to city. And I guess for lacrosse that works, but it's a little bit hard for me to get into that league if there are no, home bases for any of the teams. And it's kind of just like the Harlem Globetrotters going around the country and traveling. I don't know. I don't know if that makes me a bad, sports viewer or what. But it's kind of hard for me to see that lasting. Well, for PLL, they've actually done really well in the lacrosse market. That's actually worked for them. So clearly they're right and I'm wrong business-wise with that model for them. But as a viewer and observer, I don't know. I feel like you've got to have some form of establishing a foothold in a location and developing rivalries, giving fans a reason to, support their specific team and to defend themselves against other teams. But if you have them all just in one location, I don't know how many people from Pittsburgh are going to go all the way down to Birmingham to watch the Maulers, even if the tickets are $10, like they say, and kids get in free, which is a great deal. But, that also goes into, if the tickets are so cheap, are you really making any money? So how are you going to go off of the money model and say, we're doing this to save money? Well, you're not making that much with the games anyways, with the ticket prices that you have them at. So I don't know. We'll see, but hopefully next year, if the USFL is still around, it'll actually, go to the locations of the teams that they're hosting. So we'll see.
I'll see your cynicism and raise you because, I mean, while I similarly, and maybe more for spectacle and potentially future episodes, which is more selfish, right? The curiosity in me gets piqued, but when I first saw that the USFL brands and labels and names were coming back, I immediately felt like, wow, this feels like a naked grab to put some level of past history onto. It feels like
marketing nostalgia.
Well, that or lipstick on a pig. I mean, it's kind of. I mean, I'll be more blunt, right? It feels. And again, we're talking about teams, obviously not the Federals in this case, but the Maulers and the USFL, was interesting and in various pockets successful, but ultimately it fell apart. And there were numerous reasons, and not just Donald Trump hijacking it. I mean, there were teams in there that were, kind of on life support, and it wasn't sort of like all roses and sunshine, right? And there was real division. So if you're going to bring something back, like the Maulers, is somebody just because it's a Pittsburgh team going to slap on, a logo onto their shirt and fly down to Birmingham for a couple of weeks? I don't. It just feels embarrassingly desperate to kind of rejuvenate. Although, again, in this day of social media and streaming, and even things have dramatically changed even in the number of years since the original USFL. So, okay, if it's a head start to have sort of some logic around teams and logos and all the merch and stuff that comes around that, I guess, okay. But it's an odd thing to remember and bring back in its entirety whole cloth because, it was interesting, and it wasn't always successful, that original league.
Yeah, and one of the successes of the league, even though it ultimately became unsuccessful, was having a reigning Heisman Trophy winner going to the USFL. You're not going to see anything like that anymore. You're not going to see, the top players in college going to a spring league. They're going right to the NFL, and there's no reason not to. The money's better, the prestige is better, the marketing opportunities are much better in every way, shape, and form. So for one of the things with the USFL this time around, they do have great TV deals. Them being on Fox and NBC to start to kind of get get a foothold in the country and kind of get them eyeballs on the product. That's a fantastic thing for them. That was very good on their part, smart, and something that you never really see. You don't see Fox and NBC simulcasting games ever. So for them to do that is a good thing for them. But we'll see how much that lasts. I saw that other games are going to be on like TBS and USA, I believe. So we'll see if fans will actually gravitate towards those types of channels the way they do with March Madness during the NCAA tournament. But for now, I'm a little bit skeptical, especially with the XFL coming through next year with highly established ownership that can market it a lot better than the USFL, and who actually played the game and has this background in being a big brand himself with The Rock, being a former football player, being a guy who has this kind of charisma from his days with as a wrestler in the WWF. It's going to be interesting to see if the USFL lasts beyond this year, but I mean, either way, more football is better than no football in the spring for me. So I'm going to be watching both leagues regardless. Call me a sucker if you want, I guess.
Well, I think there are many of us out there for various reasons. I mean, some want to see a train wreck, and some want to see spring football. And in some respects, this is almost like the AAF versus the XFL a few years ago. Again, right, where now in this case this new and fairly quickly put together USFL is getting the first year out of the chute, and then the XFL is going to have year two again, and who knows what's going to disrupt it. But here's my last question for you. So this story, were there any people that you would have liked to have talked to for this, and or do you think there's even more substance to this story? Is there a longer form or even a book or something or mini documentary or something to even go further with this as obviously I'm talking to a fan as much as I am a reporter on this, or is that a bridge too far for this story?
A book, I'm not so sure about that. Also, I feel like I could have this story could have been twice as long. Like my editor cut about 1,000 words off this story, which, in my opinion, I don't know how much editors agree with this, but I think it's my opinion it's better to have too much than not enough. That way you can cut from the good stuff as opposed to trying to just pile stuff into a shorter story without, with less substance. I would have loved to have done a much longer story on this. I don't know how many other parts there are to it. But it was just very fun going back and talking to these guys and listening to these guys and building on the stories that I already knew about and hearing new ones. Not all of them were included, unfortunately. I don't know how many other people I would have been able to talk to add this. I think my editor was fine with the six. I talked to 6 or 7 people on this, including more than just players, some reporters who covered the team, and a reporter who covered the team for us for the Washington Post back then, David Remnick, who's now the editor of the New Yorker. And I talked to Jeff Perlman for this book, or for who wrote the USFL book. I talked to him for this story, and he obviously, his book was a passion project, so obviously he enjoyed talking about the Federals as well. I also spoke to Rick Snyder, who covered the Federals back in the day for, I believe, the Sports Network back then, but he's a freelancer locally here in D.C. I didn't include any quotes from him, unfortunately, because there was just not enough space, but he helped give me some kind of reestablish some of the stories that I already heard, and he gave some of his memories with the team. So it's just fun just going back and hearing all these tales from everybody about how, what their experiences were like and how it compared to their other professional experiences. I'm not sure how much more there is to do on this beyond this, or how much my editors would want to hear about the Federals, because, it's only me and like 1 or 2 other people who are actually really interested in spring football in the office. So we'll see. But so far this has been, widely applauded from the people that have spoken to me about the story. They've enjoyed it so far, and they've all said it was a fun read, which, not that I'm biased or anything, but I agree. I think it's a fun read for people, especially on, a day like today where, where the USFL is just starting out and people can kind of blend, a little bit of the old nostalgia with the new and kind of getting, adapting to and understanding the new format of the league this year. So, I'm excited to see where the league goes now.
Our mighty thanks to Jake Russell, our new pal from the Washington Post. The article from April 15th, check it out. It's called As the USFL Restarts, a look back at the Washington Federals' wild ride. Again, April 15th, WashingtonPost.com. And excellent stuff. He's a great follow. You're interested in Washington, D.C. sports. For example, he's written the 100 Things National Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. A bunch of other great columns and whatnot. You can follow Jake on Twitter at _Jake Russell, 2 S's, 2 L's, at _Jake Russell. You can follow him on Facebook at by Jake Russell. I think he's on Instagram as well, and I'm sorry I don't have that in front of me, but just find him, subscribe to him, do whatever you got to, and maybe you have some Washington Federals memories that you'd like to leave for him as well. Maybe he missed out on some things in the article. Why not pepper him with all kinds of reminiscences? God forbid we could someday get Craig James, or maybe even Kim McQuilkin, or some other folks from the original Washington Federals story. We continue to keep digging for those kinds of folks and those kinds of discussions, of course. You can follow us in our various endeavors at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can follow us on social media, of course. We're on Facebook. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available, and on Twitter, probably our most active social media platform. You'll find us at Good Seats Still. Email is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We have a newsletter. Find the link on the website. And thank you to Jerry Payne, of course, Sergeant at Arms, and all kinds of editorial goodness this week for this week's episode. Thank you, sir. And our kind thanks to all of you for listening. Every single one of you. I appreciate it very much. Whether you email us, ping us, social media, engage with us or not, we see the numbers. They continue to grow in places all over the world that completely surprise us. And we continue to try to soldier on in our own little independent way. We don't ask for much, just listenership, perhaps patronizing our space or taking advantage of our offers from our advertisers, buying a book or two through our website and the links and all that stuff. And we appreciate your support to no end. Until next week, thanks for listening, of course. And take care and stay safe, everybody.